archivist Solon Veth had read 412 incident reports over the span of a career that most other cadre scholars would have considered quietly distinguished. He had cataloged first contact failures, trade disputes, and the occasional military seizure of an unregistered vessel. He had written the intake forms, cross-referenced the species files, and submitted his findings to the Council with the measured neutrality his office required. He had never, in 412 reports, found himself reading the same passage twice because he did not believe it the first time. The seizure report from the Vithani corridor was 3 pages long in standard notation. The date stamp read 47 days prior. The vessel identified was a human survey ship, small class 14 crew, registered under an outer territory charter that predated the Marathi corridor claim by 6 years. The boarding party had arrived in 6 ships and had taken control in less than 2 standard hours without a single exchange of weapons fire. The human crew had been confined to their quarters. The engineering bay had been secured, or so the report stated. Solon read the phrase fragile and outmatched in Drevak's preliminary assessment. He noted it in his margin log with the same notational mark he used for species labels that had later required substantial revision. Then he read the final status entry, which was 3 lines long, and used the phrase hull stabilization, completed by single crew member, tools unspecified, corridor sealed. He read it again. He set the data shell down, face up, on the reading table and sat for a long moment without reaching for anything else. The Cadre Council had assigned him to observe this particular incident because the Cadre had a charter interest in the Vithani corridor question, and because Solon had spent the last 11 years building the most complete human behavioral file in the known archive. He had interviewed 17 humans across 4 separate stations. He had read every contact record the Cadre fleet had generated. He thought he had a reasonable model of what the species was. Reading that final entry, he understood that his model required adjustment. He did not yet know by how much. He pulled his travel case from beneath the reading desk. Inside, folded carefully at the top, was a pair of worn work gloves sealed in a documentation sleeve, tagged as physical evidence from the Vithani incident. They had been forwarded to him by the junior crew member who had been present in the access corridor during the 17 hours in question. He looked at them through the sleeve without opening it. The palms were dark with grease and something he cataloged provisionally as dried biological fluid. The fingers on the right hand showed evidence of extended pressure application across the knuckles. He set the sleeve beside the data shell and began writing his preliminary notes from the beginning. He had to go back further than the seizure report. The file required it. The survey vessel Meridian Cross had departed from Outer Station Halloway 7 weeks before the intercept. 14 crew, mixed role complement, small class hull, registered for a mineral survey of the Vithani subsector. The charter was legitimate. The corridor claim the Marathi had filed was newer than the charter by 6 years, a point that the Marathi fleet commander had declined to acknowledge in his boarding documentation. Solon noted this also, with a separate notation mark. Joe Chen had been the engineering officer on 3rd watch. His service record, which Solon had requested through standard channels and received within a day, was 22 pages of technical assessments, maintenance logs, and 2 commendations for work completed under reduced power conditions. He had been with the survey service for 9 years. He was 34 years old in human reckoning. His physical file listed him at standard human baseline, 1.8 meters, 79 kilograms, no augmentation, no specialized biological conditioning. The commendations use the phrase sustained function past component tolerance twice in different phrasings, which Solon found unusual enough to mark with his revision notation. His personnel file also contained one personal record entry, which was not standard for a survey officer's dossier, and which Solon suspected had been included because the junior crew member who forwarded the gloves had specifically cited it in her cover transmission. The entry was brief. It noted that Chen had transferred out of the Colonial Support Division 8 years prior, following the Ferris Station incident. Ferris Station had lost 212 colonists in a pressurization failure. The entry did not elaborate. Solon cross-referenced Ferris Station in the Human Colony Archive, found the incident report, read the name listed under surviving family members, and closed that file without writing anything in his margin log. Some data did not require notation. It organized itself. Before the Marathi fleet arrived, the Meridian Cross had been operating on a 2/3 power schedule because one of its secondary couplings had failed 11 days out from Halloway. Chen had filed a maintenance report and a workaround protocol. The workaround involved routing primary power through the remaining coupling at a load the coupling's rated tolerance listed as acceptable for short durations. The protocol was sound. The crew had been running it for 11 days without incident. Solon had spent 11 years building a file on human anomalies, and the ones that consistently resisted classification were not the biological ones. Every species had biology that surprised other species. What humans did that no other species in the file did was document their workarounds with the same procedural calm they used for standard operations. They wrote the same sentence structure for coupling rated for this load and coupling not rated for this load, but we have calculated the margin and will proceed. The margin was always specific. The tone was always identical. He found 3 anomalies worth cataloging during the 47 days of the incident record. Before he reached the part of the file he already knew he would have to read slowly. The first was recorded on the 3rd day of confinement. The 14 crew members of the Meridian Cross had been restricted to crew quarters, 2 per room, with a Marathi guard posted at the corridor junction. At hour 19 of confinement, Solon's observational log, which the junior crew member Tava Miro had been tasked with maintaining as the cadre charter representative aboard, noted that the humans had begun passing written notes through the shared ventilation access. The notes were not plans or distress communications. They were, by Tava's transcription, jokes. 3 of them referenced the guard by a nickname the crew had apparently settled on within hours of his arrival. The nickname was not flattering, but it was not hostile either. It was the kind of label, Solon reflected, that one applies to a problem one has decided is manageable. The second anomaly came from the 4th day. Tava's log noted that Chen had asked the Marathi guard posted nearest engineering whether he could access the bay to check on the coupling load. The guard had refused. Chen had asked again the following morning with different phrasing. The guard had refused again and reported the request to his superior, who noted it in the Marathi record as evidence of human anxiety about their situation. Solon had read a great deal of Marathi documentation. They used the word anxiety to describe any repeated behavior they found difficult to interpret. He made a note that the behavior was not anxiety. He was not yet certain what the correct word was, but anxiety was not it. The third anomaly was the one Tava had flagged most specifically in her cover transmission, and it was the one Solon kept returning to as he built his preliminary notes. On the 9th day of confinement, one of the human crew members, the navigator, a woman named Sarah Okafor, had begun singing. Not loudly, not as a protest. She had simply started, in the late hours of the ship's night cycle, singing something low and sustained that Tava's log described as without discernible tactical purpose. Within 20 minutes, 2 other crew members had joined from their separate rooms. By the end of the hour, 8 of the 14 were contributing. The Marathi guard had filed a noise complaint. The humans had continued for another 40 minutes and then stopped when the watch changed, apparently satisfied. Solon sat with that entry for longer than he sat with the others. If you have found this record and are following the Vithani proceedings for the first time, the Council's indexed reference number will be at the close of this account. That is all the interruption this file warrants. He moved to the section of the record that covered the pressure event because the singing was important, but it was not the center of the file. The center of the file was 12 hours into the ultimatum. Fleet Commander Drivak had established his formal claim to the Meridian Cross on day 1 and had repeated it daily in the ship's public channel log with consistent phrasing. An unsponsored vessel in a recognized corridor, he had said on day 1, crewed by fragile and outmatched personnel who would do well to cooperate with established procedure. He had said a version of this on day 7, in a joint communication addressed to the human crew and to Tava Miro in her capacity as the cadre observer, which was the procedural threshold Solon noted with particular care because addressing a cadre charter observer in a joint communication with an unsponsored crew implicitly acknowledged that the observer's report would carry weight, and Drivak had done it anyway, which told Solon something about how confident the fleet commander was that the report would not matter. The coupling had been deteriorating for 3 days before Drivak issued the ultimatum. Solon found the engineering logs that covered this period, which had been uploaded to the charter buffer as part of Chen's standard maintenance protocol, and the logs were written in the same procedural register as every other entry. The coupling was running at 112% of rated tolerance. Chen had noted this with a recommended reduction in load that the Marathi boarding protocol had made impossible, because the Marathi had sealed the primary control console. He had filed the note anyway into the buffer, into the charter record, with the same timestamp format he used for routine checks. On day 12, Drivak issued the ultimatum on the main channel. His voice, translated through the cadre standard relay, carried the particular flatness that Solon associated with Marathi officers who had never been surprised by an unsponsored species. The vessel Meridian Cross will open its cargo manifest and complete transfer of registry within 12 hours, Drivak said. Failure to comply will result in a controlled hull breach at the forward coupling junction. The crew will have time to reach the emergency pods before the breach propagates. This is the standard resolution for fragile and outmatched personnel who have exhausted the patience of this command. He used the phrase for the 3rd time. He said it the way a clerk states a filing category. He said it because, for every other unsponsored species in the Marathi encounter record, the phrase had been followed by compliance. Tava Miro's log for the next hour documented what she could hear and see from her position in the corridor outside the crew quarters. She was 23 years old in standard reckoning, a junior observer on her first solo posting, assigned to the Meridian Cross as the cadre charter presence because the assignment had been considered routine. Her log entries for the first 12 days had been careful, thorough, and slightly formal in the way that junior observers' logs often were when the junior observer suspected their work would be reviewed. Her entry for the hour following the ultimatum was 4 words long. It said, "Chen has gone aft." Solon read the longer logs that followed and then went back and read Tava's 4-word entry 3 more times. There was something in its compression that the longer logs, thorough as they were, did not quite capture. It was a sentence written by someone who had understood immediately what it meant and had written it down before deciding whether to follow. She had followed. The engineering bay of the Meridian Cross was not a large space. Solon had requested the vessel schematic from the charter office and found that the bay measured 11 meters by 7, with a ceiling low enough that Chen, at his height, would have had approximately 15 centimeters of clearance. The primary coupling housing ran along the starboard wall. The console that would normally be used to manage the power routing had been sealed by the Marathi boarding party, which meant that the only way to address the coupling load manually was to open the housing itself and work directly on the coupling contact array. This required tools. Chen had his personal kit, which survey officers carried as standard equipment: a pressure wrench, 2 contact probes, a set of insulated grip pads, a spool of conductive binding, and a pair of work gloves. He had set the gloves down on the deck beside the housing before he opened it. Tava's log noted this detail with the specificity of someone who did not know yet why it would matter, but suspected that it might. The coupling contact array, when working with a sealed primary console, could be managed manually by adjusting the individual contact loads by hand. Solon had asked the Cadre Technical Division for an assessment of how long this would take for a single operator without console support. The assessment had come back in 2 parts. The first part said it was theoretically possible. The second part said that no species in the Cadre technical file had attempted it under current conditions without at least 3 operators and a functional diagnostic relay. The Human Survey Service had neither. They had Chen. He worked for 17 hours. Tava's log covered those hours in entries that started at regular intervals and grew shorter as the night cycle deepened. She had positioned herself at the access hatch, which she could not open because the Marathi guard had locked the exterior corridor hatch, but which had a grating she could see through. Her entries documented what she could observe: Chen moving between contact points, making adjustments by feel in the lower portions of the array where the ambient light did not reach, stopping periodically to consult the handwritten load calculations he had made on a sheet from the navigator's spare log. He had done these calculations before he opened the housing. He had done them without a console. The math on the sheet, which Tava photographed and included in her log, covered both sides. At hour 4, he sustained the first injury. The contact array at the 3rd junction was live at reduced load, and a grip pad that had been placed under pressure for 4 hours had begun to compress in a way that altered its insulation profile. Tava's log recorded the sound as a sharp impact followed by Chen saying one word I will not transcribe. He pulled his hand back, examined it in the array's light, wrapped the palm with conductive binding from his kit, and returned his hand to the junction. His hand was still wrapped in binding when he finished. 13 hours later. Solon read this section 3 times. He had interviewed 17 humans. He had read every contact record the Cadre fleet held. He had built his file with the patience of a careful scholar who believed that sufficient data eventually resolved any question. He had a category in his working taxonomy called Sustained Function Past Biological Comfort Threshold, and he had noted it in connection with humans more often than with any other species in his file. He had not understood, before this record, exactly how far past that threshold the notation might apply. At hour 9, the Marathi guard posted outside the engineering corridor hatch ran a sensor sweep of the bay and reported to Drevak that the single human crew member was still working inside the housing. Drevak's recorded response was a pause of 4 seconds, which was unusual for Marathi command communications, and then a request for clarification of the sensor data. The guard confirmed. Drevak did not respond further for 22 minutes, which in Marathi command protocol indicated a reassessment in progress. Solon had requested the bridge audio record from the Marathi compliance office through the joint arbitration filing window, and the office had released a redacted segment of approximately 19 minutes covering the period between the sensor confirmation and Drevak's resumed contact. The audio carried the standard Marathi bridge ambient. the low cycling tone of the command consoles, the periodic acknowledgments of the secondary watch officers, the slight whistle of the atmospheric scrubbers running through their fourth cycle maintenance pass. Drivak's voice opened the segment. He addressed his tactical officer, a Marathi commander identified in the bridge log as Tactical Officer Rishev. He said, "Run the breach protocol against the current coupling load. Project the failure window if we initiate the controlled breach as scheduled." Rishev's response was logged at 14 seconds. He confirmed the current coupling load at 108% of rated tolerance, slowing in deterioration rate, and projected that a controlled breach initiated at the scheduled coupling junction would propagate as designed through the forward hull section. The crew would have time to reach the emergency pods. The breach would resolve the seizure within approximately 40 minutes of initiation. Drivak acknowledged the projection. He did not order the breach. His next instruction was to his communications officer, a Marathi lieutenant identified as Lieutenant Sevren, who had handled the joint channel relays for the previous 12 days. He asked Sevren to confirm whether the cadre charter observer's filings to the charter buffer had been routed through Marathi compliance review before transmission, as standard inter-authority protocol provided. Sevren confirmed that they had not been, because the cadre charter buffer was an autonomous system, and the Marathi boarding protocol had not provided an interception path. Drivak acknowledged the response. The audio recorded a pause of approximately 40 seconds. Then, Drivak said, in a register Solon recognized as Marathi command grade verification, the kind of register a fleet commander used when he wanted his bridge officers to mark their understanding of what was being said. "The charter observer's record will reach the cadre council unmediated." Confirmed. Sevron confirmed. Rishev confirmed. The bridge log noted the verification with the standard procedural notation. The next thing on the audio was the sound of Drivak crossing the bridge to the secondary tactical console, which was reserved for boarding action contingencies, and which Rishev had been holding through the seizure period. He stood at the console for a measurable interval. The audio captured the click of his service cuff against the console's edge, which was a Marathi officer's habitual gesture when reviewing a tactical projection without speaking. Then he said to Rishev directly in a quieter register, "What is the encounter precedent for an unsponsored species sustaining engineering function past our biological window without console support?" Rishev took 6 seconds to respond. The pause was not unusual for Rishev, who Solon had read about elsewhere in Marathi service records as a methodical officer with a long service designation. He said, "The Marathi encounter file lists no precedent." Drivak said, "Cross-reference the joint galactic file." Rishev said, "Cross-reference will require an interval. The joint galactic file is not held aboard at full breadth." Drivak said, "Begin the cross-reference. Continue monitoring the coupling load. Hold the breach order in standby." The audio segment ended there. Solon had read the bridge log entries that followed, and they were not as detailed as the audio. Rishev's cross-reference query, which the Joint Galactic Files response logs confirmed, returned a single matching entry from a Palian technical file dated 41 years prior. The Palian entry described an unsponsored crew, species not specified at the time of filing, but later identified as Vaithani corridor humans on a different survey vessel, sustaining a damaged drive coupling for 19 hours under boarding pressure conditions. The Palian entry had been filed without follow-up because the Palian Council had determined that one instance was insufficient evidence of species-typical behavior and had archived it under non-recurring anomaly. Drivak read the response at hour 11 of Chen's work. He acknowledged the cross-reference and asked Rishev one further question. He asked whether the Palian entry had been reviewed by Marathi Command at any point in the 41 years since its filing. Rishev confirmed that it had not. Drivak acknowledged the confirmation and instructed Rishev to continue monitoring. The audio of that exchange was not in the redacted segment Solin had received, but the bridge log preserved the question and the answer in their entirety. And the question was the question. Drivak had not asked whether the Palian precedent altered his current tactical assessment. He had asked whether his own command structure had been carrying the precedent in its archives without reading it. Without, he did not issue a revised ultimatum. The 12-hour window had passed at hour 8. The hull had not been breached. Solin had reviewed the Mirathi tactical record carefully, and the reason the hull had not been breached at the 12-hour mark was that the coupling load, which had been the designated breach point, had begun to stabilize. Not fully. Not safely by any standard the Mirathi technical division would have accepted. But the rate of deterioration had slowed, and by hour 7, it had leveled, and by hour 9, it was holding. The Mirathi sensor array was good enough to read that. Drivak was good enough to understand what the reading meant. He had threatened a controlled breach at the coupling junction, and the coupling junction was being repaired by hand by a single crew member in the dark, past the 12-hour deadline still working. The whole breach had been the lever. The lever had found no purchase. At hour 14, Tava's log entries had reduced to single sentences. She had been sitting on the corridor deck with her back against the bulkhead for most of those 14 hours. Her entry at hour 14 said, "He is still working." Her entry at hour 15 said, "He stopped twice to flex his hands. He started again each time." Her entry at hour 16 said, "I think he knows I am here." Her entry at hour 17 said only, "He is done." The coupling load stabilized at 104% of rated tolerance, which was not ideal but was within the range that Chen's handwritten calculations had identified as sustainable for the remaining duration of the survey mission. He had not been trying to fix the coupling fully. He had been trying to hold it long enough. Solin noted the distinction. It was characteristic of the entries in his human behavioral file that dealt with sustained function under constraint. Humans in those entries were rarely trying to achieve the optimal outcome. They were trying to achieve the sufficient one, and they were willing to endure the difference in cost between optimal and sufficient with a steadiness that his file had not adequately measured before now. Chen closed the coupling housing. He picked up the tools from the deck, returned them to his kit, and sealed the kit. He picked up the work gloves. He held them for a moment, then set them back down on the deck beside the housing, and Tava's log recorded that he stood with his back against the far wall of the bay and his eyes closed for approximately 90 seconds without moving. Then he opened his eyes, looked at the access hatch, and said, with the same procedural register he had used in 11 days of maintenance logs, "It'll hold." 2 words. Tava's log rendered them in standard notation and added no commentary. She did not need to. The log's timestamp showed that Chen had been working for 17 hours. The coupling was holding. The hull had not been breached. The 12-hour ultimatum had expired 5 hours earlier, and the ship was still intact. Drivak's command record showed a 40-minute gap in communications following the sensor confirmation that the coupling had stabilized. When he resumed contact, it was through the standard channel without the joint notification format that had included Tava in his previous communications. He spoke to the human crew directly. His voice had the same flatness it had carried throughout the seizure proceedings, but Solin, who had read enough Marathi diplomatic communications to parse their register with reasonable accuracy, noted that the flatness had a different quality. The previous flatness had been the flatness of an authority reading from an established script. The new flatness was the flatness of a person who has stopped reading because the script no longer describes the situation. He said, The corridor claim dispute will be submitted to the joint arbitration process under standard inter-authority protocol. The Meridian Cross is free to proceed on its charter course. This command will file its own corrections to the seizure documentation. He did not use the phrase fragile and outmatched. He did not use it again at any point in the remaining documentation. Solon noted the absence with the same notation mark he used for species labels that had required revision. Tava Miro's final log entry before the Meridian Cross resumed its survey course was longer than any of her others during the incident. She wrote it in the engineering bay, sitting on the deck near the coupling housing, the work gloves still on the floor beside her. She wrote, "I have been a charter observer for one standard year. I have read the files the archive maintains on unsponsored species. I did not understand before this posting what the files meant when they noted human sustained function past expected threshold, because the files are written in a register that is appropriate for species cataloging, and the register does not carry the specific quality of sitting on a cold deck for 17 hours watching someone refuse to stop. I will submit a full supplemental observation when I have rested. I want the record to say that I was there and that I stayed. I think that matters." Solon had read that entry 4 times before he began writing his council presentation. The cadre council session that reviewed the Vithani incident convened in the chamber that most senior observers regarded as appropriate for mid-weight disputes, which was to say a chamber large enough for the 17 standing members, their attendance, and the physical record submitted by the observer of record. Solon had submitted the standard documentation through the charter office 3 days before the session. He had also submitted the physical evidence sleeve containing the work gloves, which was slightly unusual for a council presentation and which had prompted one of the senior members to ask, in a brief pre-session communication, whether the physical submission was strictly necessary. Solon had replied that he considered it material to the presentation. He did not explain further. He presented the Vithani incident in the order the file required: the charter record, the seizure documentation, the procedural violations, and the human crew's conduct across the 47 days of the incident period. The council members listened with the attentiveness they gave to mid-weight disputes, which was thorough, but not marked by urgency. When he reached the section of the presentation covering the 17 hours in the engineering bay, the chamber was quiet in the way that large formal chambers become quiet when the people inside them have stopped preparing what they will say next and have started listening instead. He presented Chen's service record. He presented Tava's observational log. He presented the handwritten load calculations, both sides of the sheet, rendered in holographic enlargement against the chamber's main display. He noted, without emphasis, that the calculations had been correct, that the approach had been sufficient, and that the coupling had held. He then read aloud from Tava's final log entry, the section about sitting on a cold deck for 17 hours, watching someone refuse to stop. When he finished reading, he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I have been maintaining the human behavioral file for 11 years. I submitted an interim assessment 18 months ago in which I noted several anomalies that resisted standard species catalog classification. I am revising that assessment. The Vithani incident has provided sufficient data to support a formal recommendation." He paused again. "We have been filing humans in the wrong category." It was the only moment in the presentation in which his voice carried something other than the measured neutrality his office required. The council members noted it. One of them, a senior delegate from the outer assessment body named Delegate Yaron Lessa, asked whether the recommendation was for charter sponsorship review or for a broader classification amendment. Solon said it was for both, and he explained why. The argument took the better part of 2 hours to lay out. He cited the Paulian precedent that the Marathi cross-reference had returned, which had been entered into the council's working file as part of the supplemental documentation. He cited the 17 prior interviews he had conducted with humans across 4 stations, 3 of which contained behavioral notes that paralleled the Vithani record in specific structural ways. He cited the maintenance log register that had emerged as the most consistent identifier of human procedural behavior across his entire 11-year file. Delegate Lessa pressed him on the boundary between species-typical behavior and individual exceptionalism. She asked whether one engineering officer's 17-hour effort, however thoroughly documented, was sufficient evidence of species-typical capacity. Solon had prepared for this question. He had prepared for it because Delegate Lessa was the council member whose own assessment work had taught him to ask it of his own files years ago. He answered that the Vithani record was not the basis of the recommendation. The basis was the 11-year file, of which the Vithani record was the most recent and most thoroughly documented entry, and that the Vithani record's value was not in establishing that humans could sustain function past expected threshold, but in establishing that the procedural register in which they did so was consistent across conditions, vessels, and individuals. He said, "The crew member who watched him said she stayed because she needed to know if he would finish." She used that phrase, in writing, for the council record. The crew member who sang on the 9th day did so without tactical purpose. The crew members who passed jokes through the ventilation access did so within hours of being confined. The behaviors are not exceptional in any of these individuals. They are characteristic across the file. Delegate Lessa noted the response. She did not press further. A second senior delegate, Delegate Kova Aron of the Inner Records Office, raised the procedural question of how the council should treat the Joint Galactic File's existing classification of humans, given that the proposed amendment would require coordinating with at least 4 other authority bodies whose own files would need to be updated. Solon said he had drafted a coordination protocol and submitted it as part of the supplemental documentation. Delegate Aron acknowledged having read it. He noted that the protocol's projected coordination interval was approximately 17 standard months, which was on the longer end of acceptable for an amendment of this scope. He asked whether the interval could be reduced. Solon said it could not, because the protocol included individual species by species review windows that he considered minimum credible for the receiving authorities to consider their own evidence. He said, "We are not asking other authorities to accept our reclassification. We are asking them to perform their own. The interval reflects the work." Delegate Aron acknowledged the response and entered it into the record. The third senior delegate to speak was Delegate Miran Voth, who held the chair for Cadre Inter-Authority Relations and who had been silent through the first portion of the session. Delegate Voth asked Solon one question. The question was whether the recommendation, if accepted, would alter the Cadre Charter Office's standing protocol for assigning junior observers to potentially hostile boarding actions. Solon had not anticipated this question, although in retrospect he understood that he should have. He said that the recommendation did not directly address the protocol, but that the Vithani record contained a specific datum that the Charter Office might consider, which was that the junior observer's presence at the engineering corridor hatch had been the source of the most precise observational record the Council had received. He said the protocol question was for the Charter Office to determine. Delegate Voth acknowledged the response. The session ran longer than mid-weight disputes typically did, which the Council recorded in its own way by not calling for a recess until the argument was fully heard. The arbitration proceeding regarding the Marathi corridor claim resolved within the following standard month. The Meridian Cross's original charter predated the claim by 6 years, which was a straightforward matter once the documentation was correctly filed, And the documentation was correctly filed because Tava Miro had maintained the charter buffer with the thoroughness her training required, and the Mirathi boarding protocol had not thought to address. Drivak submitted his corrections to the seizure documentation as he had said he would. The corrections were accepted. The joint record noted the resolution without further commentary. Chen returned to the Meridian Cross's third watch engineering post when the survey mission resumed. His maintenance log for the first day back on course noted that the coupling was holding at 104% of rated tolerance, and that a replacement part had been requested through standard supply channels. The estimated arrival time for the replacement was 43 days. His log entry acknowledged this, noted the current load margin, and recommended continuing on the adjusted protocol he had calculated during the incident period. The entry was 3 sentences long. It used the same sentence structure as every other entry in his maintenance log. Solon had read it 3 times and found it consistent with every assessment his file had ever made about how humans recorded their work when they considered the work finished. The council record of the Vithani incident listed Tava Miro's name as primary observational witness and noted her supplemental report as entered into the permanent human behavioral archive under her certification. It was the first time a junior observer's supplemental report had been given that designation without the standard 3-year review period, and the senior delegate who approved the expedited designation noted in her own record that the designation was appropriate because the report contained a specific quality of observation that the standard review period had been designed to develop, and that Tava had already demonstrated. Tava received the notification on the transit vessel back to Kadri Station, where she had been reassigned following the incident. She read it twice. Her response to the archive, filed through the standard channel, was 1 sentence. "I want the record to reflect that I stayed because I needed to know if he would finish." That sentence was added to her supplemental report as an appendix, which Solon had approved from his own archive desk without hesitation. Solon Veth completed his amended human behavioral file assessment 62 days after the Vithani incident closed in the joint record. The assessment was 49 pages in standard notation, which was long for a species behavioral amendment but not unprecedented. The document's final section was titled, "In the Convention of Kadri Scholarly Practice," with a summary phrase drawn from the body of evidence. He had considered several phrases. He had settled on one that he felt was accurate in the way that careful outside observation, given sufficient data, eventually becomes accurate. The phrase was not what the Mirathi fleet record had used. It was not fragile and outmatched. It was not any of the other labels the galactic consensus had applied to humans in the 30-odd years since first contact. It was a phrase that described what the file actually contained, what Tava's logs actually documented, what the handwritten calculations on both sides of a navigator's spare log page and the 17-hour maintenance record and the coupling holding at 104% actually amounted to when read in total by a scholar who had learned to trust specific evidence over institutional category. He did not include the phrase in the council presentation. It was for the file. The council had received the argument and the evidence and had made its own determination, which was appropriate, and the determination had been the correct one, which was satisfying in the way that correct determinations were satisfying when they had taken 11 years and 47 days and 17 hours to arrive at. He did pick up the documentation sleeve one more time before he filed it in the physical archive. The work gloves inside were still dark at the palm. The right-hand knuckles still showed the evidence of 17 hours of pressure application. They were the kind of object that accumulated meaning slowly, the way that most things in the behavioral archive did, until the moment when the meaning was sufficient and the file could be closed with the appropriate notation. He set the sleeve down on the archive shelf, between the indexed data shells, in the section reserved for human behavioral evidence. He made a small mark in the margin of the assessment document, the same notation mark he used for species labels that had required revision. Then, he filed the assessment, closed the document, and sat for a moment at his reading desk in the amber light of the archive chamber. Somewhere at the edge of the Vithani subsector, a small survey vessel was running its third watch maintenance log. The coupling was holding,